All right, folks. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. So excited. My name is Sarah Kent. I'm the Vice Director of the FRI. We're so happy to have you here for today's discussion. We are talking about utility commercialization of fiber and other communication assets this morning. It's a really big topic. So I'm just going to do a couple quick housekeeping things, and then we're going to let our distinguished panelists get to this. We are all in the same room. If you would like to turn off your video and your microphone while they're speaking, that'll help the rest of us be able to see them front and center in our conversations. But especially as we get into the Q&A, we'd love to see your shining faces and hear your voices. So you do have control of turning them on and off at will. Please use that responsibly. And now I'm going to let Ellen have the floor. Ellen Katz. Lately, she needs no introduction. She's been all over the news. So we're really, really happy that you made the time to be here today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here, and I'm really excited to have this distinguished group of panelists. They're all people that I've been working closely with over the last couple of years, and they are some of the real thought leaders on commercialization of fiber and utility networks. And so I think we're going to have a great conversation. Just to let you know what we're going to do, I'm going to start with Josh Broder, who's the CEO of Tilson, which is where I work right now as Vice President of Utilities. And he's going to sort of set the stage. And after that, we wanted this to be, I feel like there's been maybe a little bit of webinar fatigue. So we're going to have this be a little bit more of an open dialogue. So after Josh makes his presentation, we're open for questions then. Then we'll go to John Smola, who's at Alabama Power, and Alabama Power and Southern Company have been at the leading edge of utility communications and broadband deployment. And he's the right person at the right time to talk about the utility perspective on commercialization. And finally, a man who also needs no introduction, Commissioner Brandon Presley from Mississippi, who has led the charge, I think, on the regulator perspective for sort of helping utilities think about their role in commercialization and telecommunications and broadband deployment. He sort of led the charge of getting both regulators and utilities to think about it differently. So from that, then we'll open it up to questions. So after each panelist, there'll be questions. We'll have questions at the end. I have a bunch of questions because, you know, I get all these people in one room. I want to pepper them with my own questions, but I'm going to give you guys the floor first. So with that, Josh, let me hand it over to you.
Thanks, Ellen, and thanks to everyone for having me on this morning. I'm Josh Broder. I'm the CEO of Tilson, and we're on a mission to build America's information infrastructure. And our connection with utilities is that in addition to building fiber and wireless networks for telecom carriers, we also wind up consulting with and designing and building broadband networks for utilities, which are then used for grid modernization and increasingly for broadband in underserved communities. And so what I wanted to do today was just to provide a brief overview of how we think about network planning in utility networks over a longer time frame with more sort of comprehensive network architectures, and how sort of this use case for grid modernization is providing a basis for which particularly large investor-owned utilities can successfully then support community broadband efforts. And so I'm getting to broadband, but bear with me as I take a detour through grid modernization to sort of lay the framework of how these networks are coming into existence. So, you know, in our history as a company, what we have found is we've been hired repeatedly to deploy networks for individual applications. And so it, you know, started in the early 2000s deploying advanced metering infrastructure networks, and those advanced metering infrastructure networks often had their own network. And you know, interestingly, in communities where there's no broadband to be found, those advanced metering infrastructure networks often would bring a broadband connection to every home, but would only be used to connect the meter. And then later, as distribution automation became more widespread, and you know, moved from like early, you know, sort of very, you know, narrow band sort of SCADA applications to more broadband applications where you could do a lot more on the grid. And we went downstream into the transmission and distribution networks, into the things that were controlled, like reclosers at the circuit level. We saw, another round of ad hoc network deployment, to serve those kinds of applications. And now, as we look to other things like distributed energy generation and demand response, we see yet again more networks being built to serve those applications. And we think this is a challenge for affordability for ratepayers, because ultimately a huge part of the cost component of each of these new grid modernization applications is in the transport networks that are their lifeblood and in connecting them. And so what we've seen in our consulting world with our investor-owned utility customers in particular has been shifting from trying to do business and rate case planning around a specific single application that includes all the costs and all the benefit, to moving towards a longer term planning horizon where you think about a shared network infrastructure at the utility that is used to support all of the applications today and future applications which haven't emerged, to essentially lower the barrier from a cost and affordability standpoint for ratepayers to let those applications then come onto the grid. And so over time, mechanically, that's evolved into essentially two kinds of facilities. One being fiber to substations and to other important nodes on the transmission and distribution network, sometimes even as far downstream as some of the devices down at the circuit level, like capacitor banks and reclosers, but more often to the large nodes like substations. And then increasingly private networks that are either LTE or 5G to provide ubiquitous coverage for smaller devices where there wouldn't be really a great business case for bringing fiber to that level, in addition to supporting the utility's own workforce as they travel about their territory and do restoration at times when other more traditional telecommunications may be disrupted. And so what that gives us then is a platform that starts to become predictable, a utility with a fiber network deeper into their distribution network, closer to where their customers are, and then some overlay of some wireless service that today, starts to have some really meaningful speed and capacity relative to wireless networks of yore. And so here's where I think broadband comes in. What we have seen is that the two models emerging of utilities participating in broadband has been, typically small consumer-owned utilities getting involved at a retail level, saying, look, we provide maybe water, gas, and electricity, so now we're also going to provide broadband as another service. We already provide a multi-service bill. But as you get to the investor-owned utility level, and you look at sort of the regulatory pressures from an affordability standpoint, like once you get outside of transmission's been subsidized universe and get into the ratepayers bear the full cost kind of environment, it becomes very challenging to talk about other lines of retail business while also with a straight face maintaining a sense that you can really deliver reliability and affordability to ratepayers. And so what we've seen emerging is what I would describe as a wholesale business case for utilities to then lease their facilities to retail ISPs or other broadband actors to then provide a retail service. And from a rate standpoint, in many cases, these are either sunk cost facilities, essentially things that have already been baked into the rate case and had been underwritten by grid modernization, or as part of a new deployment, were coming, and there was some sense that there could be recovery from third parties while also serving a public good. And so the rub that we found from a regulatory and technology standpoint has been, how do you take a facility that has a really high cost to get it out there, but a relatively low, modest cost to increase its size and capacity, and have that provide some kind of a public good, which in this case would be, community connection to broadband, while also maintaining affordability and the focus of the utility. So we've seen this idea of wholesale infrastructure leasing, and we see it at several levels. I mean, the most fundamental level has been the pole lines themselves. And so in most territories, the IOU is the sole or joint owner of the pole infrastructure and serves a critical role in the deployment of broadband, simply by leasing their private property in the public way back to carriers. But what you do wind up with is a lot of duplicative infrastructure. So you have fiber cable, fiber cable, fiber cable. And in areas where there isn't an underlying fundamental business case to deploy a retail broadband service, then broadband providers still don't come. But when a utility says, well, I've got my own fiber cable to get to this substation, and I have 24 available strands, then you now start to see the ability to lease some of those strands to lower the cost of that ISP to get into town and then to make extensions to individual homes and businesses. And I think it's this fundamental tension that a investor-owned utility has some of the longest kind of vesting period in a community, right? That you'll find few longer-term stakeholders than an IOU in its own territory, and the economic vibrancy of that community, and this sense that their regulatory framework is very constrained. They need to focus on reliability and cost. And this is a way to deliver a public benefit while potentially providing some benefits from a ratepayer affordability standpoint. And so, if I would just summarize all of that, I would say, the three emerging trends we think are really important are longer term planning in network deployment, to have a shared infrastructure for all grid mod kind of applications. And then the idea that, if you're a consumer utility, a small consumer-owned utility, and you have a desire and an ability to provide a retail service, that's great. And then if you're a large investor-owned utility, the idea that you can provide some of these grid modernization facilities on a fractional basis, wholesale back to retail actors in the marketplace who can then, with essentially an underwritten business case to get in cheaper, provide a service while also recapturing from a ratepayer affordability standpoint, some of that benefit. And so that's what I would describe overall what's happening. And I'm super excited to hear a bit more from John today about how they're doing that in practice in Alabama Power, and also from Commissioner Presley about the big wins they've had in this area in Mississippi.
Josh, I'm going to just ask you one quick follow-up and then see if the audience has any questions. You mentioned that there's a move toward this integrative planning. What if you're a utility that's been, doing a little bit of AMI network here, a little bit of connecting your substations with fiber, and you're not starting fresh? Is there still an opportunity for commercialization?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, ultimately, one of the challenges we face is that the rate case cycles are relatively short. And so what I would say is what's really important for utility, especially if they have, a legacy of ad hoc networks, which most utilities would, that would be essentially the ground state of most utilities looking at this, is that they not have a 2 or 3 year vision, but they have a 10-year vision. And so that as they make incremental investments, that they are building towards a more cohesive, homogenized infrastructure that can be leveraged for multiple applications, as opposed to perpetuating kind of a fragmented kind of network approach. And when going to the commission with a 10-year plan in hand, and having a vision for both the public good and the affordability benefits of doing that, it makes sort of underwriting some of those things, excuse me, in the rate case in the current period, a bit more rational and digestible, I think, for the commissions and their staff.
Okay, great. All right, we'll see if anyone's had their coffee yet and is ready to jump in on a Friday morning. Does anyone have questions for Josh at this point? Okay. Oh, Susan, did you have something?
I was just going to ask, how does, on the utility side, how would the ratepayer benefit?
Yeah, so I'll try and offer a concrete example. And obviously at a network scale, this functions and with some more complexity, but at a really fundamental level, imagine you have a mile of fiber optic cable. It costs $50,000, and you really only need half of its capacity for your grid modernization, and you lease out the other half. You could imagine that $25,000 is now available either to reward the utility for delivering the public benefit or to return to the ratepayer on a affordability basis. And so at some level, the ratepayer was going to pay for 1.0 of that cost because it was underwritten for the grid modernization applications that it was supporting. And so now by having some kind of a lease back to a carrier, then that additional revenue stream then provides either rate relief or an enticement to the utility, or more likely some combination of both.
Thank you. So all of those things need to be figured out, probably on the front end or the
Yeah, that is the challenge. And what I would say is that very progressive utilities have pushed their commissions, have come to them with, a number of years of successive education around this and good ideas, and have made their case. In other cases, and I think we'll hear some about this today, you'll hear maybe both use cases. Commissions have been very progressive and have pushed their utilities to do it. And so I don't think it really matters which direction it comes from, but I think there is a sense of inevitability around, look, there can be some recovery on some of those sunk cost resources. And on a forward-looking basis, we can underwrite these projects a little bit differently, knowing that this is coming. And so, whether it comes from a utility making an impassioned argument or from a commission directing, and as is probably the case, there's some combination thereof. I do think that where you see this working really well is where there's become a well-worn trail at the commission level to do this. And, that these things don't move overnight. So, it's a year or more, I think, of education and discussion, and in some cases, multiple years of going, from pilot to scale on some of these pathways.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Rick, hand up.
Yes, Josh, thanks. We in Missouri are working to get legislation passed that will provide some adjustment to rights of way and easements, and also give some protection for eminent domain and property rights. So legislation has not passed yet, but that's the model that Ameren, Missouri is supporting. It's just what you described, that we're building out our smart energy grid with fiber to our substations. And we'll look for retail partners to take that fiber and run that on to end use customers. So we do not intend to be an internet service provider of utility as an investor owned, but we have committed in the legislation to be able to flow those excess revenues back above our make ready costs, to put those into our revenue requirement and keep downward pressure on electric rates for our customers. So that's the model we're pursuing.
Yeah, Rick, that's a great example, of how this is happening in real time. For those that may not be following this legislation, I'll call out that this is a problem in many, many states still. And that is that there is an underlying legislation in many places that would allow a power utility who has a private easement for their transmission or distribution lines to then utilize that same facility for some other communications use that wasn't operating the grid. In most cases, either the regulatory or statutory gravity essentially allows them to use their incidental communications facilities, for their own purposes. But as soon as you start leasing it out to a third party, now we have potentially, the challenge of having to go back and perfect easements in a way that, really isn't practical. And so I think in a number of states, there's been a legislative push, and Missouri is a great example, which I think is a model for the rest of the country. This has actually been more popular in the Midwest, where there's some really big patches of, rural areas that are tough to get to essentially by right to say if a power company has an easement on private property for their own facilities, that the ancillary use for telecom by third parties is considered allowed by right. And so I actually think that model legislation is probably something that many states will need to do to sort of fully exercise this option, particularly in places where there's lots of right of way versus public street right of way, kind of distribution and transmission.
And I can, I'll talk a little bit about this, Josh and Rick too, but to sum it up, I would say in Alabama, the state legislation that addressed what Josh and Rick brought up was probably, if I had to point to one thing about our story and our plan here, it was that legislation that allowed us to create these partnerships that I'll share a little bit about. But I think that's a great point. It really was what allowed us to, go forward, go over the edge, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, well, maybe this is a good time to pass the ball to you, John. And Rick, looks like there's interest in seeing your legislation, the proposed legislation, if you have a link to it to put in the chat. If you don't, I actually think I can probably find one while John is speaking. Yeah. Oh, Rick, do you?
Elena, I will send last year's version, the 2021 session version, to you, where we're still working to finalize with all investor-owned parties the language for next year's session. But I'll send you what we filed last year. It won't change dramatically.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
John. Yeah. Thank you, Josh. That was great. And I see John will share his as well. John, I'll let you
Yeah,
go
thanks.
ahead now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ellen. And thanks everybody for being part of this conversation. Looking forward to continuing this discussion. Like Ellen said, I'm John Small. I'm a director in our marketing and economic development organization at Alabama Power, an investor and utility part of Southern company. And our focus, my team's focus, is really on what Josh did on a little bit, identifying partnerships for our infrastructure, executing those partnerships in the name of broadband and community development. So over the next few minutes, kind of gonna share our story. And it is a multi-year story. As Josh said, this is not a quick fix, an overnight fix. Our most recent chapter of the story kind of started, I would say, back in 2018. But it is a story of infrastructure and commercialization. So first, I'm going to talk about, like many of you, what's the situation facing Alabamians and citizens of many other states? What solutions did we see that we've hit on a little bit already? And we've been at this for a few years, so I'll share some of the results we've seen from the solutions we've deployed and really where are we going, what's our path forward. So to start, Alabama Power is committed to elevating our state, like many other utilities out there and public service commissions. And now that's not only just providing safe and reliable service to the communities we serve, but we believe it's also finding ways to enhance the future of our state. Alabama, unfortunately, our broadband rankings and high-speed internet access are really behind pretty much the entire country. So we believe by collaborating across the company, creating public-private partnerships, and good legislation, we've really driven some meaningful gains in our state's digital divide. That really started with fiber deployments to support our electric grid. We identified an opportunity to be an infrastructure solution provider to telecommunication companies with a focus in rural areas. So as Josh mentioned, utility companies have a lot of existing telecommunication infrastructure, both wired and wireless, with many aspects, especially new builds that have surplus capacity in areas that can be used to serve customers in rural areas, suburban and urban as well too. And our fiber strategy does start with making our grid smarter. It is a grid modernization strategy focused on reliability and resiliency and cybersecurity for our customers. But it's also a fourth focus to facilitate the expansion of broadband services throughout our service territory. Much like every corner of our state benefited from the expansion of electricity over 100 years ago, we believe connectivity can create the same opportunity and accelerate the foundation electric utilities built at the turn of the century. So we understand that to enact this change, we need to work cross-functionally, specifically, and I could talk about this for other utilities on the call. We had more than 10 internal departments engaged in our overall strategy to facilitate these changes. And externally, we've created a coalition that has 30 plus members that is really focused on state legislation and partnerships across Alabama. So really the solutions, as I mentioned, it's a threefold solution for us. We've mentioned infrastructure, that's the focus of this call. So I'll talk about our infrastructure. I will talk about coalition building and partnerships, and then get in a little more detail on legislation that we've already hit on a little bit. So for us, fiber infrastructure is the gold standard. With the ongoing advancements in technology, the data needs on our grid, the real-time demands of a communication network, it's crucial to us to continue to deploy fiber. To better serve our customers, we're making substantial investments across the transmission network, but also our primary distribution network with overhead and underground fiber investments. These enhancements do make our grid smarter and more resilient. They improve reliability and restoration times, and we've seen numerous use cases now over the past few years of how this has really played out. So these advanced technologies create a more segmented and automated electric grid. You heard Josh mention reclosers and various devices. With the deployment of these, we're able to stack a lot more with a fiber network and really now have the ability to auto restore segments of our grid that have outages and really reduce the number of customers affected and their time without rolling our crews and our trucks to restore some of that service. So fiber allows us to respond and restore quicker than we ever seen before with wireless networks. It's the necessary conduit combined with automated devices that provides the best intel and data for optimal restoration. And then when and where we have this surplus capacity, we can utilize it to help build a better Alabama. So with each fiber deployment, Alabama Power, in partnership with our Public Service Commission, does have additional capacity along both our transmission and distribution networks. We call these middle mile networks, like many of you all are well aware, and we recognize it's an important role that these middle mile assets have partners with telecommunication providers to use our infrastructure as a backbone for their own service build. So that infrastructure solution was found, but it was only one part of it. The next part is really around coalition building. When we started this process back in 2018, we started to enlist other utilities, other businesses, other nonprofits, other industries across the state. We formed what we call the Alabama Rural Broadband Coalition, ARBC, and its mission was simple. We believe every Alabama citizen should have access to high-speed broadband internet service. This coalition recognized the important role of broadband and it plays for economic development and education opportunities that we've all seen over the past 2 years, more so than ever. We also see new industries such as agriculture really need access to these networks, and agriculture for our state is the biggest impact to GDP, and their digital needs continue to grow and is an important partner in this coalition. So really, we have these resources at the table, more voices combined together to really focus on broadband expansion, but their main focus was first on legislation. So soon after this coalition was built in 2018, they turned towards the legislature session in 2019. Two bills came out of that session that were focused on the expansion of broadband access in rural and underserved areas. One was a grant program to support not only last mile builds, but also middle mile network builds. And then one, as Rick mentioned earlier, was primarily focused on utility rights of way for electric service, but how we use those existing rights of way now for internet service, both directly or indirectly with partners. And so the coalition was focused on those two bills and successfully got them passed, really with bipartisan support throughout that legislation cycle. Middle of 2019 in May, the governor signed both acts into law and really put us on a path for a better better state. And then on the regulatory front, it's not just legislation, it's also regulation. Throughout this process, we worked with our Public Service Commission here in Alabama and their staff to really create a model for how Alabama Power could use our fiber assets to support broadband internet service. And really ours is a partnership model, being an IOU in our core business of providing safe, reliable electric service. We are not in the business to increase the regulation on our company. And so really we wanted to find the right partnership model that kept our Public Service Commission's role as they wanted it, but then allowed telecom providers to use our fiber network to provide that internet service. The main conversation around with this is, with these partnerships, how do we ensure it's not impairing the core purpose of these fiber assets, which is the safe and reliable electric service. So in the partnership with the Public Service Commission, we created a model of regular reporting for our fiber deployments, but also the partnerships that I can get into more details for those that are interested. But it's an ongoing conversation, ongoing partnership, ongoing reporting with our Public Service Commission. And I will say at the end of the day, they are very supportive of Alabama Power furthering or utilizing our fiber assets and wireless assets, and really being more aggressive that in the name of community development, economic development, and closing the digital divide throughout Alabama. So some of the results after this threefold solution. So within 6 months of those two previously mentioned bills becoming law, we announced our first strategic partnership in late 2019 with a company I know Commissioner Presley is very familiar with, in Ceasefire out of Mississippi. That was our first telecommunications partnership. One of our first fiber builds was in Jasper, Alabama, a small rural town northwest of Birmingham. And we entered into a innovative partnership where Ceasefire leased some of this middle mile network that we were building in our primary distribution network, and then they would build the last mile to various neighborhoods in downtown Jasper throughout that county. Following that, C Spire announced other deployments throughout the state, one area northeast of Birmingham and then south of Birmingham as well too. So just with C Spire, we have 3 large geographic areas where they're leasing our infrastructure to deploy last mile internet service. And then within those multiple communities within those 3 areas. Right at the turn of this year in January 2020, we announced a partnership with a Georgia-based company called Point Broadband, and they are expanding their fiber network from Georgia into our state. And we had fiber deployments on the state line in and around the Auburn area, Lake Martin area, and we entered into a similar partnership with them where they're now using our middle mile network to build out in East Central Alabama. And then most recently, this was the first partnership we had with a rural cooperative utility, Tom Bigby Electric, who created their own internet company in Freedom Fiber. So them being a rural cooperative utility created a separate business in Freedom Fiber, and we entered into a partnership with them in Fayette County, where they are expanding their internet service build into, and really helped them move quicker into that area and offset a lot of the costs for that build. So really a lot of great partnerships with all different types of telecommunication providers. And for now, the question, what's the path forward? How do we maintain this momentum? And our work really does continue throughout the state. Our plan, very simply, even from an electric utilities perspective, is to inform, educate, and grow. Our tactics are really focused on the state legislature to continue to educate and engage them on these topics. It's community outreach to the general public throughout the state, and then it's our continued partnership with our regulators and staff. So that's our story over the past 4 years now. And we have a lot more to come, and we're really excited about our role as an investor-owned utility in this space. And at this time, Ellen, I will take any questions or have any continued conversation.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask you a quick question. You mentioned that these projects, they can be hard and they can be long, which I think is, a good thing to keep in mind. But we also asked about consumer benefits earlier. What's been the reaction of the consumers who've had the benefit of these access to broadband?
Yeah, I would say it's twofold. And I think it was kind of to Susan's question a little bit earlier. For us, from our perspective, one of the benefits a lot of our customers, ratepayers, don't see is the enhanced reliability. They see our communication about how reliability has improved in these areas with all of this technology. But that's a good thing. We don't want them to really see that, because then they don't know what they're missing there. But from on the broadband front, I mean, so we've seen a story in Jasper, for example, where now their entire downtown has a pure fiber network with internet service being provided by C Spire. They've also starting to build a Wi-Fi network off that downtown fiber network. And so just the citizens in Jasper on that example, from a sense of place, from a community development, just from the businesses there, I would say some of the best comments we've gotten are from Mayor O'Malley in Jasper, who's really trying to position his city to be, one of those really great little towns right by the lake to live on, but not be disconnected from the rest of the world, and being able to do that for his business and residential constituents there. So, I mean, when they get it, it's fantastic. It's almost, how quickly can they get it? How quickly can we deploy? And as we've mentioned, it's not a overnight fix. Deploying infrastructure is not easy, and it is not quick, but when they get it, it's been an absolutely fantastic response, Ellen.
Great, thank you. Creating a sense of place. I love the way you put that. Any other questions for John at this point? Jump in, raise hands. Yes, sir, Commissioner.
Oh, no, I was adjusting my volume. I'm sorry.
Ah, okay. Well,
I was getting nervous, Commissioner, about what you were gonna ask.
I just want to mention, maybe it's a little bit of a commercial. There's, I put a link to the Utility Rural Broadband Playbook in the link. If you haven't heard about this, Anterix commissioned me to put together sort of an overview of what's going on in the industry, and it features interviews with thought leaders in the industry, including your three panelists. Has a whole section on ratepayer benefits, has links to the legislation in the industry. So feel free to take a look at that if you think that will be useful. And well, let me then turn this over to one of the most colorful and impassioned proponents for utility broadband commercialization in our industry. And as a former ratepayer, consumer advocate, I always appreciate Commissioner Presley's belief in squeezing a quarter until the eagle cries when it comes to maximizing ratepayer benefits. So, Commissioner, I'm a Connecticut Yankee, so I had to look up that saying, but I thought you might like that one.
Yeah, you did good on that. You're welcome to the South, Ellen. Thank y'all for having me on today. And first of all, let me just say before I get into my comments, Ellen, thank you for all the work that you've done. I know you're transitioning to this new role at FERC, and this nation is going to be served well with you in that job. I told Rich Glick I don't think he could have picked anybody better. And so I think we look forward to working with you in a new role on this. And don't forget utility broadband when you get there. I know you won't. But
thank you.
Thank y'all for the opportunity. We're trying to, in Mississippi, we went from when we first started looking at broadband access, just in a whole sense in our state, we're elected by the people. And I've taken great pride now in holding over 250 town hall meetings in fire departments, community centers, church fellowship halls, courthouses, city halls, to go out and talk to my constituents. And one of the issues that, never failed to come up was access to broadband, especially pre-pandemic. That was a topic on the mind of rural Mississippians at that time. We have great pride in being the birthplace of the rural electric cooperative movement in America. We'll actually next Tuesday celebrate with a historical marker from our State Department of Archives and History, the spot where the first rural electric cooperative in America was ever created in Corinth, Mississippi, back in 1935. And so using that model and looking at not only on the cooperative side, but on the IOU side, what we could do, and you're going to hear me say this word a lot, to take a holistic approach to meeting the needs of our citizens. We began looking at broadband access, and one of the first things we did was had to remove a 1942 prohibition on our electric co-ops from being able to sell anything but electric appliances or electricity. They didn't have that problem in Alabama. Steve Foshee over at Tom Bigby in Alabama had me over, and I brought 44 members of the Mississippi House and Senate, almost a full 1/3 of our legislature, somewhere close to that, over to see what they were doing. And we got that 1942 provision taken out. We got a good law passed in 2019, the Mississippi Broadband Enabling Act, which opened up the ability of our rural electric cooperatives to go into the broadband business. Now, in doing that in 2019, we had no idea. Look, I was the cheerleader. I never let my pom-poms come down of trying to push that law through. And we were able to do it and beat back some very entrenched interests that had a decade to expand broadband service, but never got it done. And we wanted to give that opportunity to our co-ops, and we got that passed. And since then, it has been a tremendous effort in our state. Today, there'll be about 2,000 people working to connect folks in rural Mississippi to broadband through their electric co-op. We're connecting about 2,000 houses a week in our state to minimum 100 up, 100 down, fiber to the home broadband service through co-ops. Now, moving through that, we began looking at what were the other opportunities. And quite frankly, Alabama Power stole a little bit of a project from our idea of these projects from us when we worked out a compromise a couple of years ago with Entergy and C Spire, which is a Mississippi-grown telecom broadband provider. Very focused C Spire is on rural areas and how they can help, maybe if they're not the end provider, that they can facilitate that. We put together a project with them back about 4 years ago now, in which they would build the needed fiber for the electric utility, Entergy, and Entergy would be the anchor tenant that made that a viable solution, which brought broadband access to 15 rural counties and 22 small towns in Mississippi as a way to get that there. Fast forwarding through what we did with the co-ops, and I'm proud to say today, Mississippi, when we first set foot at Steve Foshi's place over in Hamilton, Alabama, trying to educate our legislators, we were 51st in the United States of America in 2018. Today, we're 42nd. We have jumped, and I think we're going to bypass the folks in Alabama in the coming years of the work that our co-ops are doing and that we're doing with our investor owns. And we are working, Southern Company, both being the parent company of Alabama Power and Mississippi Power. We're sharing a lot of those experiences across the state line, trying to learn from one another, and some of the successes that y'all have had, John, in Alabama. We want to learn from those. This year, we tried in both the Broadband Enabling Act and in Senate Bill 2798, which is what I put a copy link to in the chat. We tried to learn from the experiences that others have had and deal with particularly the easement language that we were afraid was going to be something that would hang up deployment. We got that taken care of for co-ops in Senate Bill 2790, in the Broadband Enabling Act, and then for investor-owned utilities in Senate Bill 2798 this year. Our focus is an all hands on deck approach, period. We're not going to stop and we're not going to allow the same old political dialogue that has kept our state so severely disconnected to stand in the way of what we know is going to be the future for our children, for our economy, and for our future. Look, bottom line of it is everybody on this webinar today is interested in the economic development of their people, of their state, of their region. And you're not going to do that in the age that we live in today without broadband access. Communities that cannot connect cannot compete. It's just that simple. And we want to make sure that in our state, we are deploying every single resource. And so when we began in our integrated resource plan for our investor-owned utilities, one of the things that I was fortunate to get written into that plan was a $35 million per year investment into grid modernization and fiber deployment, $10 million specifically for fiber deployment, and the other $25 million could be a mix. So $35 million total. We wanted to remove the cumbersome regulatory burdens of coming in to get a certificate from the commission prior to deploying that. So we got that out of there. And we, of course, will look back and we will true that up, and it's got to be on the up and up. But we did not want to slow down what we know is going to need to be a fast deployment. So we created both a path of revenue. We dealt with recovery for the utility. And by getting Senate Bill 2798 passed this year, that really was the last completing act, if you will, for large-scale fiber deployment by our electric utilities, because then that cleaned up both the easement language and the ability to third-party contract that out. Now, our legislature, working with the commission, came up with what I think is a very good, I don't want to say compromise, because I think nobody was really on the opposite side of this, but that the utility would be able to rate base those assets. They're going to build, look, for regulators on this webinar, utilities today and in the future are going to be building fiber whether we deal with broadband or not. It's going to be deployed. It's going to be built because of the grid of the future. The question for all of us representing people is whether or not Ms. Smith is going to have a fiber line in front of her house that is simply communicating for that utility network, or whether or not we're going to stop off and allow her and her family and her children to have broadband access if possible. That's the real question here. I deal with constituents daily that say, Brandon, I've got a fiber line in my yard. They tore up my yard and cut Aunt Bertha's tree. And I'm still mad about that from 10 years ago, but I cannot get connected to broadband service. Well, that is a travesty in a state as rural and as poor as Mississippi is, and we're trying to pull ourselves off the bottom. We don't want to repeat those mistakes in the future when it comes to utility deployment of broadband. If we can, under any scenario, be able to provide broadband to Ms. Smith in that scenario, we want to do it. And we want to encourage other providers to get in the business, to come in, to lease that. And under our Senate bill, all of those revenues from those third-party leases, again, come back to the ratepayer. The cost of packing that fiber tube full of fiber is incremental compared to the cost, obviously, of construction. Why in the world would we in a poor state, in a rural state, that is very severely disconnected go out and only have 5 strands of fiber in a tube when we can pack it full of 200 plus and be done with it. We do not want to repeat the mistakes of the past that we saw mainly, and I call it out, in the telecom industry, particularly with some of our bigger providers, where we know that fiber is in places is serving only one customer and others are not being able to connect. We're not going to repeat those mistakes. So Senate Bill 2798 clears that path. It gives the commission wide discretion to deal with every one of these issues as to making sure that it's going to unserved areas, making sure that we are deploying fiber in a responsible way. And the benefits are going to be great. We're going to be making an announcement. I hate that if there's anybody on here from Mississippi Power, I'm stepping on your press just a minute, but they're going to be an announcement in the next 10 days about a contract that has been let between both Mississippi Power and one of our broadband providers. Also, Entergy in Mississippi, where we were looking prior to the rise of Delta to make a huge announcement of their fiber deployment. We're not going to leave any stone unturned. And if anybody in the regulatory or in the utility space today believes that electric utilities are not going to play a vital role in broadband expansion, they're living in an alternate reality. It is going to be a part of it. We should face that as regulators. And my time as NARUC president, I tried to say this at every turn. Not only should we face that, we should lead. Commissions are not courts. Regulators are not judges. We are there to advocate and protect the public interest and to move that forward. And one of the key ways we can do that is for regulators to lead by talking about this. Look, I've never been on the company side of things, but I can imagine that if the regulatory community were to be talking more about this and to be pushing these type of ideas, I think that it sends a signal out to industry and investors and to others that this is the way of the world. And this is what our regulators are going to want. That I can't speak for anybody in any other state, and I can't speak for my colleagues. I can only speak for me. But for me, I think it has to be a part of every conversation where we're talking about grid modernization, where we're talking about the grid of the future. We've got some great examples from Hurricane Ida, where the self-healing network of Mississippi Power Company, because of deployment and grid modernization, truly led to one hell of a great story related to the outages and how those outages were corrected quickly and were handled in a manner that we couldn't have dreamed during the days of Katrina. We wouldn't have dreamed during past storms. And we saw that in an ice storm. Mississippi Power this year, because of climate change and other factors, will be a dual peaking utility, where our peak will be not only in the winter, not only in the summer as traditional in the South, but also in the winter. How are we facing those type of realities? And they're just realities we got to deal with. And at the same time, dealing with the holistic needs of our state. Well, I think that you can do a heck of a lot in self-healing networks, grid modernization, and broadband expansion. And we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We've got to be able to do that. I think another benefit in Mississippi that we're seeing, our co-ops are engaged right now with our investor-owned utilities to talk about that backhaul network. How can there be a partnership between both the investor-owned utilities, companies like C-Spire, and our co-ops to break the strain that competitors have used because of their backhaul and wholesale capabilities to hold back some of our distribution broadband co-ops. I had a co-op in my district that I represent that was in $15 million of CARES Act funding. I think it was $9 million of CARES Act funding was in danger because they could not get a wholesale contract with someone competing against them until the last 24 hours before we possibly could have lost federal funding. Now, if that's not anti-competitive practices, I don't know what anti-competitive practices are. And we want to make sure that we don't allow that to continue, and that these IOUs and co-ops be able to come together and look at an example of what they're doing in the state of Arkansas with the Diamond Network, I think they call it. And we're looking at something called Magnolia Connect. How can we come together and have that backhaul and bypass folks who would otherwise try to strain our capabilities? But it all begins, in my opinion, with regulatory leadership, with commission leadership. This is a new, and John may not want to say this, but I think most folks in the utility industry would agree. This is a new space for them. Mississippi Power, Alabama Power weren't out talking about broadband 5 years ago. They were not. They were leaving that for somebody else. But the world has changed. And with what we've seen in this pandemic, every one of us in elected office or to be ran out of office if we are not talking about how do we deploy every hand on deck to fix this. Utilities are going to be a part of it. The regulatory community can aid in that by, number one, talking about it. Number two, finding ways to have assurance for recovery that meets the public interest test, that meets all of the rules and requirements in your state. But you're going to be building fiber for grid modernization. You're either going to do it now or you're going to do it in the future. The question is whether in your state you are doing that in a way in which advances the holistic needs of your people. And we're all charged with, in some degree in our laws, to look at economic development. I don't think there's anything that meets every test as a regulator more than grid modernization, fiber deployment, partnerships with broadband. We don't have any of our OUs that are even interested in taking the calls about getting internet service, but they want to be a facilitator and they want to be a partner in doing that. And I think this is a place where the electric utilities can help us in a nationwide effort. And I quite frankly think it's our duty, seeing what we've seen through this pandemic, that everybody find a way in which to be a part of the solution. And I think that exists. And so I appreciate the chance to join y'all today. We look forward to what the benefits of Senate Bill 2798 are going to be in Mississippi, coupled with that Mississippi Broadband Enabling Act. We want to see Mississippi be known for being the most connected state in the United States of America. And I'll point this out. As of today, just 2 years after our bill passed, we went from no electric co-ops providing broadband to 17 of the 25 in our state. Now, when you take into the fact that they encompass and bring service to 85% of the land mass in Mississippi, you do the math on that. 17 of the 25 serving 85% of the land mass ain't a bad deal. And our IOUs are going to play a major part in not only the co-ops efforts, but in their own service territories where they are serving electric customers in Mississippi Power Energy. I get calls every day. I see you talking about co-op broadband, but I live in Entergy's territory, or I live in Mississippi Power's territory. What are you doing for us? And our answer to that is going to come in the form of some public releases soon, but we are making those partnerships. And the commission has taken the position in Mississippi that we want to make sure the public interest is met. We're going to go through our statutory obligations, but we also want to be the group that are pulling people in a room and saying, we want to see the state move in this direction, sending that regulatory signal so that both the providers and the utilities see that we're serious about this. And I'm proud of the work that we've done, and we're going to continue to try to lead on this and get the work done in Mississippi. Thanks, Ellen, for having me on.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you so much. We have about a few minutes left, so I would encourage you to unmute yourself, raise your hand, or just jump in with questions. But in the meantime, I actually have a question for Commissioner Presley, and really for John and Josh as well. This all makes so much sense, particularly hearing the three of you talk about it from different perspectives. Why isn't this going on all over the country? Like, who's opposing this? What are the opponents? Like, if this were easy, or why isn't every state embracing this model?
Oh, it's real easy. I mean, I'm going to be a little controversial in these topics. I'll tell you exactly. We had to fight AT&T, Comcast, and you name it in our legislature. And the issue that we have had is companies that have had decades and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to go out and serve these customers. They don't want to serve them, but they don't want anybody else to serve them. And when we come up with unique ideas that don't fit the mold, then it is Katie bar the door, and this is something in which we should not, this is non-traditional. I think that's one reason. Second reason is it's a non-traditional space for regulators. Let's be honest. I mean, there's not been the Alabama PSC hadn't been talking with Alabama Power about broadband prior to the crop up of this issue. So I think it's new to a lot of people. You've got the issues in legislatures related to the easements, and that has to be cleaned up or you're dead in the water. And so I think that has been a big part for us, or what we've seen has been the lobbying power, and we beat them. We've got a unanimous record of getting this passed in our legislature, but that's been one issue. The other thing is getting regulators comfortable about it. And I taught, Ellen, you were part of a lot of the conversations on the task force I created as neighborhood president, but that is a big part of getting regulators comfortable and realizing, let's not miss this opportunity. You're going to be getting grid modernization filings before your agency. Don't miss that opportunity, whether you're hearing it from the governor's office or like me, hearing it from voters. I think that it's those two true realities.
Great, Josh. Yeah.
I agree 100% with Commissioner Presley on those barriers. I would also add, there is the leadership dynamic. And so, you have a regulator who's waiting to see, what creativity the utility is going to bring, and you have a utility waiting to see what environment the regulator is going to set. And so in a place where you have a courageous commission, or in a place where you have a courageous utility, somebody needs to move first and form the conversation to get to the place where then you've got to work through the legislation, potential opposition, getting the framework in place. But I do think that, we are seeing more states move in this direction. Virginia has a workable framework now that's happening, and middle mile infrastructure is going into the air today, in Dominion territory, for example. So, I think we see other commissions and utilities looking at these early successes in Mississippi and Alabama and saying, we can do that too.
And on the utility side, Ellen, it does seem somewhat common sense, but the expansion of new technology into new areas for a business that's 100+ years old, you have those waves, not against you, but waves that you gotta work through. So understanding the internal business case of utilizing new technology in new areas and the benefit it provides within our traditional model is math, but it's not the most simplest math for everybody in the utility space, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Susan, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Commissioner.
Yeah, Ellen, I was just going to say this, and I think this is playing out on the national level right now. And full disclosure, I'm a Franklin Roosevelt New Deal Democrat. So, I will say this in criticism of the Biden administration to a certain degree. There's not enough talk about this in the infrastructure bill. There's not enough talk about utility deployment of broadband on a federal level, and there should be. That makes no sense. We're in these separate silos, and they're together. And if we want to talk about modernizing the grid, we want to talk about truly taking advantage of renewables and all the things that we know are coming down the pipe, we should be talking about on a federal level these type of projects. I'm not saying it's a whole hog approach, but it has been crickets when it comes to this type of integration from a federal level, and it is nonsensical. This should be an integral part of finding ways that FERC and NTIA and FCC and NERC and others should come together. And I really, intend to be pressing that in any forum that I can. It is a nonsensical approach from a federal level not to be having exactly the conversation that's going on this webinar.
I would just add very, very quickly, this is an economic development issue.
Amen.
And that's how this has to be framed in states like Alabama or Kansas, where our population is somewhat stagnant or we're losing it in the rural areas. And if anything, the pandemic showed that for a lot of people, you can work anywhere. And so why not work in Kansas? But if we don't have that connectivity, it's not going to happen. But this is all about economic development. And I think that's how it should be framed. And I agree with you, Commissioner Presley. The leadership at the top is critical to allowing us at the state level and then the local level to accomplish what's needed to be done. But this is clearly economics.
Great. Thank you. John, did you have a comment?
Just to build on what Commissioner Presley said from a DC conversation, it wasn't until within the last year, and I think EEI was instrumental in this, where IOUs and other electric utilities were even applicable for federal programs related to broadband infrastructure. Right. It was the reverse. We were intentionally not eligible for it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Maria, I'm going to give you the last question. I'm so happy we've had such a great dialogue.
Hey, everybody. Thank you. This is Commissioner Bocanegra, Illinois. Great discussion. I guess my question is, are there any supply chain issues with this type of investment? And if so, can you guys talk about quickly, how those costs and challenges are shared across either the utilities or the people that you're partnering with on the receiving end, folks who are maybe leasing the network from you guys?
I might share very quickly, we're engaged in building, dozens of these networks around the country, and there isn't one of those projects that isn't challenged by the current supply chain difficulties. And, what I would say is costs are up. The costs are up modestly, 10-15%. Really, it's about lead time now, where things that used to take 3 weeks now could be back ordered for a year. And so actually utilities are uniquely positioned to be able to bring their economy of scale in terms of the materials they buy to some of these solutions. Utilities often have forward-looking contracts with their suppliers and buy at significant volumes in ways that small carriers can't. And so I think utilities do less worse in this current environment, but it's a major problem. And as federal funds flow into broadband projects all over the country here, coming out of the American Recovery Act, we expect the supply chain situation to be much more difficult. Ultimately, I think this isn't so much something you'll see in the lease rates downstream. I think it'll be in the timing of the delivery of these networks is probably the bigger impact.
There's a workforce issue too, if you just talk about bottlenecks to deployment.
Yeah, that is a great point. Well, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you for being great panelists. Thank you for being a great audience. I would note, take a look at the chat. There's a lot of really good information that's been flowing there too. And I'm going to give you my personal round of applause to Josh and John and Commissioner Presley. And Sarah, I hand it off to you.
Thank you all so much. This was such a great discussion. Thank you to our audience members who asked questions and participated. And thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate it. We look forward to hearing more from all of you in the future. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.